if progress was inevitable, it wouldn't have taken humanity 200,000 years to have an industrial revolution. If progress was inevitable, most places around the world would be rich and prosperous. The surprising thing, though, is that, because we've seen the cost of setting up a new company and the cost of exploring going down so much because of technology, right? I mean, if you take technology like the cloud, it's been enormously helpful to smaller firms. But at the same time, we're seeing business dynamics in decline. Europe managed to catch up in mass production in the post-war period. It's failed to do the same in digital. And I I think an important question is why? Um, I think a big part of the answer is that the single market is just much more harmonized for goods, although clearly far from perfect. And so when it comes to services, the IMF estimates that if you take all barriers to trade inside the European Union and add them up, they amount to something like 110% tariffs. Trump Liberation
Mm.
Day tariffs, self-imposed inside the European Union, and that obviously caps the return to investment in digital in Europe.
The reason I was so keen to have to speak to you today is that, like, you're professor at the Oxford Institute Internet Institute, but also one of the most cited scholars on the political economy of technology, which is such an important area. And so it's a real pleasure to speak to you today.
Good to be with you.
And to start off, could you just outline kind of the key arguments in your book, The End of Progress?
Sure. So the purpose of the book is sort of push back a little bit against the narrative that technological progress is inevitable. And so, if progress was inevitable, it wouldn't have taken humanity 200,000 years to have an industrial revolution. If progress was inevitable, most places around the world would be rich and prosperous today, and we wouldn't see places that once prospered stagnating or declining or collapsing. And so that's sort of broadly speaking the purpose of the book. And I think the reason that progress isn't inevitable is that as technology moves on, institutions need to adjust as well. And so different institutional settings are more conducive to different stages of the technology life cycle. So early on when you explore, you don't know if something is going to catch on or not. And so you're better off having a system where people take different bets and then you see what works out. And so the Soviet Union was the most centralized economy, I think it's fair to say, that the world had ever seen. If you were an aircraft engineer in the Soviet Union, you could go and you developed a new engine, you could go to the Red Army and ask for funding. If they declined, you maybe had two or three other options. If they declined, ID would die with you. That's quite different from the US system where Bessemer Ventures famously declined to invest in Google back in 1999. They probably regret it today, but it also underlines that Google wasn't a safe bet at the time. Alta Vista and Yahoo were dominating search, and to know if something will catch on, someone needs to take the risk um, and invest. On the other hand, when the technology is more mature, it's more conducive to planning, and so uh, air um, airplane technology was quite well established when Europe set up Airbus as a peer competitor to Boeing. The jet engine, which was the last sort of significant innovation, had already been um, invented. And so um, you were catching up to a static target. You weren't trying to catch a moving target. And so when that's the case, it's much easier to plan and coordinate and scale. And so those are two very different processes, and different institutions are can be well suited to one or the other. And I should say, in sort of the book is called How Progress Ends, and so the implication of this is that you need to move between those two phases, right? So you need to explore, then you have a prototype, you need to scale. At some time that runs into diminishing returns, and then you need to move on to something new in order to grow, and then you need sort of more decentralized structures in place for that. Some things are conducive to both exploration and scaling, though I should say. So, having a large, connected marketplace where people can move around and spread ideas, and low transportation costs, good distribution networks, and so on, is conducive to both innovation and scaling, for example.
Interesting. I really liked that argument from your book, the idea that you need the push of exploitation and the pull of exploration. And I think you illustrated it through some, like, for example, the tinkerers and inventors of laissez-faire Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then the kind of like centralized bureaucracy of like Bismarckian Germany and Meiji Japan. Um, and one of the terms used in the book, which I really thought was quite evocative, was the idea of like you have to adapt your ecological niche. Is it easy for contemporaries to understand what ecological niche they're in? Like, is it obvious, do you think, at the time? Or is it something that, say, like policymakers and politicians can easily sort of like understand if they think deeply enough about it? Or is it, to some degree, is there also like luck involved?
So I think big part is determining the question make or buy. And so businesses today do that all the time. Do we invent something internally from scratch, or do we take existing technology which is out there and tweak it and scale it? And so when the Industrial Revolution took off in Britain, um, I think it was a fairly straightforward decision to many firms and states on the continent to uh, buy rather than make, although there was a bit of both. And so, you know, states pursued various tactics to also attract talent from Britain that could make things in Germany and France. But it was more a question of catching up to the technological frontier than it was pushing it forward for the most part, although Germany clearly came to push the frontiers, particularly during the Second Industrial Revolution. And so I think the key question is, are you lagging behind, or are you at the frontier? And that sort of determines which path you choose.
Interesting. Um, see, that's interesting also with regard to like the current question about what countries should do to make themselves like geopolitically sovereign in the age of AI, because I know that, for example, that Canada has kind of like championed Cohere, their like AI company. France have championed Mistral, their own AI company. Even though those companies, like the models are, they don't, like in terms of kind of benchmarks, they don't do as well as say like Google, OpenAI, or Anthropic. And it's a kind of, yeah, it's an interesting one as to like, do you think that that question of like make or buy is relevant today around specifically the technology of AI for like for countries?
It is most certain, right? And so a question is, how access is, or how easy is it, also to access the technology that you need from abroad, right? And so during the post-war period, American technology and know-how was readily available through Marshall aid, and in large part because the concern of Soviet influence on Europe, and America wanted Europe as a buffer to Soviet influence, and that paved the way for much of the technology transfer that we see in the post-war period. It is less clear today that Europe will have access to some of the technology that is being developed in the United States. And one of the puzzles in my mind is that for the past couple of decades, I mean, it's not, predates the Trump administration, uh, Europe has, to be sure, been less dynamic, and that's maybe not that surprising, but it has also not really caught up in digital. And so, whereas Europe managed to catch up in mass production in the post-war period, it's failed to do the same in digital. And I I think an important question is why? Um, I think a big part of the answer is that the single market is just much more harmonized for goods, although clearly far from perfect. And so when it comes to services, the IMF estimates that, if you take all barriers to trade inside the European Union and add them up, they amount to something like 110% tariff. So Trump Liberation
Mhm.
Day tariffs self-imposed inside the European Union, and that, obviously caps the return to investment in digital in Europe. What both China and the United States have in common is that they have large domestic markets that firms can scale into. And so I think for Europe, a key priority needs to be the harmonization of the single market um, for services.
That is really interesting. I never actually thought about it like that, that Europe hasn't caught up in terms of digital. But I guess even in terms of kind of like startups, there are European kind of like large, European tech companies like Spotify and Klarna, but they're relatively few and far between, which I think is, and it's not like it doesn't seem to be a reflection of talent because, major tech companies open large offices in London in order to kind of hire talented individuals at like cheaper prices than they would be hired in the US. So that is a really interesting point about why haven't they caught up. I mean, because I know that in the book you also, it seems like the nature of the specific technology um has some bearing on like what kind of institutions are most like fruitful for leveraging that technology. I think you make the argument that kind of like the centralized Soviet Union kind of bureaucracy was useful for leveraging heavy industry or like building heavy industry, whereas not so much for kind of like digital. So, I mean, I guess I don't know. Maybe it's too early to say, but is there like a specific type of institutional arrangement that like particularly will help, let's say in the age of AI, to leverage AI, do you think? Or is it, yeah, is there like particular institutional agent that will specifically help, do you think?
I don't know is the honest answer. So, with regard to the Soviet Union, the reason that they did well in heavy industry was that they prioritized it and it aided the military, uh, industrial military complex in the Soviet Union, and the key priority for the Soviet Union was wasn't civilian industries, but defense. And as long as technology was fairly static, Soviet elites could essentially benchmark factory performance and hold managers accountable that way. The problem was that when mass production petered out, something new was needed for growth. That new thing was the computer revolution, to which Soviet contributions were essentially none. Part of the reason for that, I think, is that when you introduce a new technology in production, when something is new, you can't really benchmark, and so it becomes much harder to monitor performance. And also, unlike China, which is much more regionally decentralized, there was very little space to experiment in the Soviet Union without pulling the rug under the entire system. And so I think that was the key challenge, not necessarily that digital was different. It's a bit like, if you look at the car industry, it starts up with a few shops in Detroit. There's a lot of job hopping, experimentation, are very different from Silicon Valley. And then when the technology matures, uh, industry tends to move out because the price of real estate is lower outside of city centers, and then eventually migrates abroad where labor costs are lower. And so I don't think that AI is that different in that regard. I think AI development is quite concentrated to a few places. When technologies are implemented, you see them proliferate more rapidly than manufacturing industry did. But and you see, work, I think, beginnings to start to migrate abroad as well. So you see law firms reducing headcount in London, hiring more in Poland and India, for example, to save labor costs. And I think AI is aiding that process because it reduces the productivity differential between the worker in London and the worker in India, and so it makes more sense economically to offshore other tasks. So there are probably things that will be different with AI, but I think it's too early to say what the differences in those institutional arrangements needed to take advantage of AI will be. I think what we can say is that there are certain things that matter regardless what the technology is, and that's barriers to entry. So barriers to entry is going to be really important for innovation in AI. And I think, as we discussed earlier, having a large homogeneous market does really help scaling, and I think that's true more or less regardless of what the technology is.
Interesting. And do you think that AI will change the cost of exploration in a different way to how it changes the cost of kind of like exploitation? One of the reasons why I was wondering this is that so I'm currently building a startup, and it's like I use AI has like accelerated our kind of like implementation or exploitation to a really like extreme degree, but the rate of kind of exploration has increased at a much it's increased as well, but at a much lesser rate. Just because like the people who use our app, they're still only using it at like a similar rate to what they would use previously. We can still build things quicker, but yeah, I was just wondering, like, do you think that that is something that AI like do you think that AI will change the relationship between like exploration and exploitation in that sense?
Think yes, but probably in similar ways to the internet and the personal computer. And so, when I have an idea, I can check fairly quickly now using my preferred AI tool, or several of them, whether somebody else had the same idea, or what, or at least, if if somebody obviously had the same idea. But the internet did that too, right? Um, and so yes, I think that AI will reduce the cost of exploration further. The surprising thing, though, is that because we've seen the cost of setting up a new company and the cost of exploring going down so much because of technology, right? I mean, if you take technology like the cloud, it's been enormously helpful to smaller firms. But at the same time, we're seeing business dynamics in decline. And so clearly, there is something going on that is pushing in the other direction, and has seemingly more than offset the advantages created by ICT and arguably AI, although it's still early to say. And so, question is, what is that? Um, I'm at the university. We see new rules and regulations and forms that need to be filled out coming out almost every week, it feels like. That might be an extreme case, but I do think that regulation has something to do with the increasing cost of setting up. There are probably other things as well. And so, if you take an extreme example, so most people seem to believe that AI will have a material impact on medical discovery. And let's take that at face value. But even if that's true, then you still have to go through clinical trials, which is tremendously expensive, which means that you probably need to partner with a large pharmaceutical company to be able to do that in the first instance. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should get rid of clinical trials entirely to be clear they fulfill a purpose, but those safety measures, if you like, do come at a cost, and that cost is primarily prohibitive for solo inventors and for smaller firms which find it harder to manage compliance cost. I think another relevant aspect of this is what we incentivize. So in academia, it's publish or perish. And so when a new productivity tool arrives, whether it's the cloud, or whether it's AI, or whether it's the web, um, we can do one of two things, right? We can use that tool to drill more holes, do more things, or we can use it to dig deeper and focus on one thing. And it seems to me that we're more incentivizing people to do many things at any given point in time. And that means that people's attention is spread more
Mm,
thinly across multiple projects. And
mm,
we do have research showing that the more projects you pursue at any given point in time, the less likely you are to make a real breakthrough. And so I think those incentive structures might be another reason why we haven't seen, a real upsurge in research productivity, innovate various measures of breakthrough innovation, despite the fact that we have these, tools that clearly aid exploration.
that is really, really interesting. And it kind of reminds me of one of the examples in your book, which I really enjoyed, which was the Marconi who developed the radio. And I think I'm right in saying, according to your book, he developed the technology for the radio on his like estate near Bologna. And what I thought was interesting about that was one, I guess he probably didn't have loads of like distractions on his phone and could kind of concentrate. Um, but also it just seemed kind of intriguing to me that something like that could happen, that he could develop the radio and kind of like sell it to the British Navy, because it feels like today it would be harder to do that in terms of but I wonder whether, like, part of me wonders whether AI will facilitate kind of like the ability for more of that kind of like solo like inventor sort of tinkerer culture. I'm not sure, but but um but yeah, do you think that that is something that could kind of come back?
Had some help of the family butler too, and so most people don't have that. Yeah, so I think, it's entirely plausible that, artificial intelligence will democratize innovation. If everybody has, access to their army of personal tutors and research assistants, and that should tremendously aid people with good ideas. And we can see an era of more decentralized exploration, not unlike what we saw in the 19th century. I guess what sort of makes me think that that is probably not going to happen is just the experience of the past 2 decades, where ICT technology has to a large degree, you know, already provided many tools that should make exploration cheaper and easier. And we haven't seen sort of the reemergence of the solo inventor, at least not to the same degree that we did in the 19th century. It is true, though, that the computer revolution in the United States, in particular, was driven by new firms, and so it wasn't the firms that led the second industrial revolution that led the era of computers, and so there's clearly a shift around 1980s from Apple and Microsoft up to Google and Amazon, a new generation of firms that emerge and become companies in their own right. Uh, but since the 2000s, we have a trend whereby new firms seem to have exited by acquisition rather than IPO, and so WhatsApp, Instagram, YouTube didn't become firms in their own right. And it not doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing that a firm exits by acquisition. Um, but I think the trend towards greater consolidation, and particularly the trend we've seen towards killer acquisitions, whereby incumbents buy up existing firms, smaller firms, just to shut them down and avoid competition, is concerning. And the dynamism that we saw during the early days of the computer revolution is no longer quite there, despite the fact that computers are much better today than they were in 1980.
Interesting. Is it, how useful is it to use historical analogies in order to understand AI? The reason I say this is that I think they are commonly used. Sundar Pichai recently compared AI to fire. Demis Hassabis recently compared AI to the Industrial Revolution. I think Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir, I heard him comparing building AI to the Manhattan Project. I think that's a more common, as far as I understand, analogy in the US is to like the atomic bomb, where like the country that gets there first has like decisive strategic advantage, where China in their AI plus plan they kind of compare it to like the internet or electricity. But I guess like, do you think is it actually useful to think about AI in comparison to like an analogous technology, or do you think we should just take it on its own terms?
I think it depends on the point that you want to make. And so I do think, going back to my previous book, The Technology Trap, I do think the framework of replacing technologies that automate existing work, enabling technologies that create new types of tasks. That framework was developed by Daron Acemoglu and Pascal Restrepo, by the way, but that is sheds light on what can or is happening with AI as well, in the sense that if AI is just used for automation, we're more likely to see similar trends that we saw during the first industrial revolution, where wages were stagnant and probably even falling on the lower end of the income distribution. But if AI is used to create new products in new industries, well, we're more likely to see something similar to the second industrial revolution, where we saw, the automobile industry emerge, the largest industrial undertaking that the world had ever seen. We saw a host of, supplier industries emerging to produce the components going into the car. We saw a number of electrical industries emerging. Essentially, every, household appliance you have in your kitchen is from that period, and there was an industry behind it. And so I think those historical parallels tell us that, if we use AI more for automation, we're going to get something more similar to the first industrial revolution. If we use it for, developing new products, we're going, might be get something more closer to the 20th century pattern. But to say that, AI is inevitably going to, reproduce the 19th or 20th century, I think is probably not fair.
Because yeah, in that book you also describe how like technologies have sometimes in the short term caused kind of like disruption, and in the long term enabled like progress, and that partly like technological progress is determined by kind of like political impact. I guess like do you think that our society has become more um like has begun to perceive technology as more like deterministic than in the past? Like the reason I say that is that sometimes, for example, when um like Dario Amodei says like 20% of white collar workers are going to be automated, it feels a bit like quite kind of like techno determinist. And I guess like, do you think that our society, in terms of its like perception of technology, has become more kind of like techno determinist? And does that change like the politics of how people kind of, when I say people, I mean institutions, governments, and populations kind of like react to technology?
I'm not sure if people have become more tech. I mean, generally speaking, the farther back in time you go, the smaller the cross section of society you get on record. And so, if you go back to the 19th century, Marx, Malthus, 18th, 19th century, Marx, Malthus, Ricardo, they all believe in some form of iron law of wages. They don't think that, technology can improve standards of living over the long run. I think in the, mid 20th century, there was enormous optimism about what was happening with electricity and personalized travel. And I think today there is, a lot of anxiety over AI, and a lot of people saying that, well, it's the way it is, and let's hope for the best and maybe plan for the worst. And so I think there's always been some of these impulses, but I may be wrong about that.
Interesting, yeah. Because one argument that I've seen recently, which is quite interesting, is well, I've seen like a debate between Arvind Srinivasan, who basically argues that AI is like a normal technology, and then AI 2027 and co-authors like Daniel Coccatello, who basically argue that AI is like very abnormal. It's completely different to any other technology because it's going to be like self-replicating, which is kind of an interesting debate. But then Henry Farrell, I saw an article by him recently where he basically argued that we should think of AI as like a cultural technology, which is similar to like the market or bureaucracy or democracy. And that's like the form of technology that AI is because it allows like classification on a large scale, which has never been possible before. And therefore AI will like fundamentally be a new form of like kind of social organization. Which I think is sort of an interesting idea. And yeah, I mean, I guess I mean, do you think it's too early to kind of like make that classification?
So I haven't read those articles, but I don't think AI is there yet. AI is not, going to replace an organization or a firm. I think anytime soon. I mean, obviously, these timelines they keep changing, and who knows? But Anthropic did an experiment recently where they had their vending machine being run by Claude, and so uh, stocking a vending machine and selling products is it's a relatively straightforward operation you would think, but um, Claude or Anthropic employees are probably a bit more uh, experimental than others, and so they managed to trick it into selling everything at 25% discounts and stocking the machine with the metal cubes and all sorts of things. And so this is a relatively straightforward operation, and so I wouldn't want AI to be running anything too complex um, right now. And so, generally speaking, when you apply AI for fairly well-defined tasks where there's a lot of precedent, it does pretty well. But the messier something gets, the more moving parts you have that affect each other, the more unpredictable it becomes. Generally, it doesn't do very well in terms of generalizing to situations it hasn't seen before in training, and so I think that world is uh, unlikely to emerge in the next few years. Time will tell. And so, right now, I think it's best to think about the AI we have as a tool similar to the internet or the personal computer, or you can pick your favorite. And in the future, maybe, but you know, I'm I'm not.
It's really interesting. Um, do you think that historical research is going to change in the age of AI, like the way historians do research? I think I saw an economist recently write a paper about like how to use AI agents for economics, and I just thought it was kind of interesting. But I mean, are there going to be like huge teams of like AI agents going through archives? Or yeah, what do you think that it like is AI already changing historical research actually?
I'm not an historian, right? I'm an economist, so I'm not sure if I'm the best place to answer that question. But speaking to historian colleagues, challenge is for AI to be of much use, things need to be digitized. Or AI might be able to help that process, but that's the first step. And so I think, or I suspect, that historians that spend much of the time in the archives will be some of the last researchers to be replaced, but I may be wrong about that.
That's a really good point. Yeah, because yeah, the that's a really good point. Like a lot of things aren't actually digitized, and it's kind of intriguing because I imagine that sort of information also will become increasingly like precious, because I know that the AI companies, they like specifically want like very specific kind of data which involves lots of like reasoning. Understanding is like there's a push for more high quality rather than kind of quantity of information. So yeah, that's also really interesting. Um, how do you personally use AI a lot in your work?
I use it quite a bit. Uh, I mean, partly because I write about it, I feel like I, have to use it. I find quite useful for some tasks, less useful for others. The only way of knowing that is trying it and, try different things. So yeah, now I use it on a daily basis.
Awesome. I just have one more question, which is, do you have any book or article recommendations? And this could be either a book or a Substack or an article, or it could also, yeah, it could be about kind of like the political economy of technology or otherwise.
In general, or so it
Yeah,
could be anything.
it could be anything. Could be anything.
So the book that wanted me to become an academic was Joel McCure's The Liver of Riches. So I have to plug that one. I really like Doug Irvin's Clashing Over Commerce. I thought that's a wonderful history of it's a wonderful economic history of the United States in general, and it's a wonderful history of trade policy in particular. Third, uh, Adam Matus's Wages of Destruction, Making or Breaking of the Nazi Economy. I think it's a book that is just beautifully executed and a pleasure to read.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Carl. Honestly, such a
Thank you.
pleasure to speak to you, and thank you for the book. I will, yeah, I really enjoyed it and really enjoyed the chat. So thank you so much.
Been a pleasure. Much enjoyed it myself.